I think, yeah. Okay, now we have our second external speaker, Jeff Reimer from UC Berkeley. Okay, yeah. Jeff studied, obtained a bachelor degree in UC, University of California, Santa Barbara, and obtained PhD degree from Caltech. Before joining the UC Berkeley as a faculty member, he was a postdoc at IBM Research. At UC Berkeley, of course, he's interested in various topics of the research, carbon capture, gas separation, porous materials, nuclear spins, and basically based on the fundamental understanding of the chemical engineering and chemistry. I think one of the most interesting things that I learned from today was the teaching philosophy that I went through, and I was very impressed how much your dedication is really visually. I can feel the energy and so on, and that's why I think Jeff was awarded the highest award from the UC Berkeley Distinguished Teaching Award. And right now, Jeff is chair of the Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering Department at UC Berkeley. And we are very happy to have you here in the CO2 Research Center talk series. And I think, yes, now I see the red yellow arrow very clearly. So Jeff, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jubong. It's nice to be here today. You know, when I speak about climate change and carbon capture to the public, this slide still is incredibly important. And I know you have all seen this before many times, but the impact these numbers have on the public when we talk about climate change is profound, reminding them that Homo sapiens emerged about 200,000 years ago. And so we've seen, you know, two climate events already humanity has. But of course, we are here as of about a month or two ago, and of course, climbing. And so the notion that over 1 million years, we are unprecedented levels of CO2 winds up to be an effective mechanism in talking about this to the public. So let's look at in more detail at some of the concepts Arun Majumdar told us about a few minutes ago. So we think about carbon capture at an industrial or at scale from the point of view of sources, which typically are 5 to 50% CO2, like, for example, a coal-fired power plant. And we think of scalable technologies where gigatons per year of material can be handled. And then we think about the sinks, that is what it is we're going to do with that CO2 once we remove it from the source gas. I choose these 4 particular processes, not because they're the only ones, and in fact, maybe even not because they're the best ones, but they're ones that have already been demonstrated at some reasonable scale for carbon capture. And each of these 4 technologies has fundamental research and pilot scale problems that have to be addressed and addressed quickly. So for example, if you're going to bubble a gas through a solution, absorption, the design of the solvent, the chemical design of the solvent turns out to be really important to lower those energy costs that Arun was talking about earlier. If you're going to blow gas over a powder, that is adsorption, again, it's the design of the material to efficaciously capture CO2 and exclude water, for example, as a key part of the material's design. If you're going to push the gas through a membrane, there are membranes that can effectively reduce the concentration of CO2 from, for example, the exhaust system of a power plant. But the system's design is really vexing to handle large volumes of gas with small concentrations of CO2 and water. Arun also mentioned looping, that is this notion that we can react CO2 with a strong base or powders like calcium oxide or lime to produce a carbonate. This technology is known and it works very well. The issue is regeneration. That is, how much energy do you need to get the CO2 out of that base? For example, decomposing calcium carbonate to calcium oxide. So these are the fundamental challenges that go with industrial or man-made sources of CO2. And then, of course, sequestration and utilization are the primary sinks. And Arun mentioned those already, and I won't dwell on them any further. What I will say is that if you want to do direct air capture, and the need for it is very, very clear, these same technologies could be deployed, and these same intellectual or research issues remain. What I would like to do is use our time today to talk about a couple of examples in which we're looking at direct air capture or exhaust gases, and we're going to use adsorption as the technology. And the reason I'm choosing to do that is because it is from a molecular view that I can hopefully inform people with regard to process design. So how does one think about, before you sit down in the laboratory and create a material to do carbon capture, what are the things you need to think about in order to design the right kind of material? So in this slide, I'm showing on the left the sources of CO2 that one typically has to deal with, and you have to recognize that those sources have associated with them different properties that would have to go into a process like adsorption or absorption. So for example, coal and natural gas power generation have a lot of water in them, in those gas streams. Industrial sources may have other impurities associated, certainly waste incineration. And of course, direct air has this vexing problem of only 400 ppm. On the flip side, what is it we're going to do with that CO2 once our process has accomplished a separation? So for example, if we're doing geological storage, the purity of the CO2 may not be important. On the other hand, if we're going to use the CO2 to make a chemical product, like plastics or something like that, the purity of the CO2 may have to be very, very high in order to preclude poisoning a catalyst. So we have to look at what the sink is in order to inform the process requirements. And then once we've made a choice about source and sink, then we can evaluate processes like temperature swing adsorption, pressure swing adsorption, and we can look at key performance indicators that would best allow us to connect a source to a sink. And then once that is done, then we can take those KPIs, those performance indicators, like, for example, a particular type of adsorption isotherm, and then we can start screening for material properties and select ones that we think would be good, synthesize, test them, and then close the loop so that we can move quickly to a technology level where it can be deployed in the pilot scale. So this is the process by which we are thinking about how to design materials for carbon capture. And I'm going to give you two examples to show exactly how this would work. So the first example starts with an analogy to pharmacology. That is, pharmaceutical scientists are looking for small molecules that bind to particular portions of a biomacromolecule. They are trying to use computer screening to identify pharmacophores, small molecules that bind in specific ways to lead to some sort of health treatment. Carbon capture is actually very similar, just the inverse. We're looking for adsorbophores. That is, we know exactly the small molecule target we want to get. What we don't know is the macroscopic structure or the arrangement of atoms in space that will provide for that best adsorption of CO2, presumably at the exclusion of water and presumably at the lowest energy penalty to provide for effective processes. So here's how we're going to do that, or how we have done it. For example, we'll start with a database of structures of metal organic frameworks. Arun mentioned those as a class of porous materials that are being considered for gas separations and carbon capture. The nature of MOFs is not necessarily important for you in this brief talk. The idea is that there's a database out there of structures, and we can use that database to calculate the adsorption isotherms. And so we'll look at a few 100,000 of these, and we'll make a plot of the working capacity. Well, up here is where you want to be, the highest capacity for CO2, and the selectivity against nitrogen, an obvious indicator, and the higher the selectivity, the better. So having done that on the computer, we'll select maybe 8,000 or so in this box that look like they're good, high selectivity or high capacity. And then we'll go into the computer and ask the computer, by the way, for that chemical structure, what is in fact the active binding site for CO2 binding? And it's some arrangement of atoms in that material. And then we're going to bin those adsorptions according to graph theory so that we can sort them easily on a computer. Having done that, then we take those active sites and ask how sensitive are they to water absorption. So for example, on this axis is the affinity for water, and here's the affinity for carbon dioxide. And we want low affinity for water, so we exclude water from the absorption process, but we have high affinity for CO2. So this is the region we want to be in. And what are those structural types? So for example, parallel aromatic rings are a very hydrophobic site that are very aphilic for CO2. And you see some of the other structures that are shown here. So we decided to focus on this range out here, high affinity for CO2, low affinity for water, and in particular, the notion of parallel aromatic rings. And so now from this library of 8,000, we pick up maybe somewhere between 8 and 50 of those. And we'll ask ourselves, what structures do they actually have, and can they be made? So we recognize that an adsorbophore type has parallel rings about 7 angstroms apart. And then you have to go to the laboratory and use chemistry intuition or robots or all of the above. And we imagine, in fact, here was the structure that we developed based upon our computer simulation. So we made them. And it turns out to be further filtered by the techno-economic analysis and the recycling ability of the materials. So here, this particular one, which is based upon pyrene, right? You can see pyrene here as the parallel aromatic rings. The metal is the aluminum that links these together, cheap and easy to get. And this particular linker turns out to be available already in the chemical industry as it's used as a precursor in pharmaceutical science. So we designed it on the computer. We assessed which one would be good, and we made it happen in the laboratory. Now, the question is the results as good as the computer simulated? So here's the adsorption isotherm as a function of pressure. And I show here the comparison between experiment and theory. And it's really quite good, and it's especially good at the low pressures associated with CO2 absorption. So we made it on the computer, and it absorbs like the computer said it would absorb. You make a pipe and you pass gas through the pipe and you measure a breakthrough curve. And we recognize that the breakthrough curve is very similar, wet and dry, which means, yes, it is resistant to water absorption and preferential to CO2 absorption. Can it be cycled? So here's the working capacity as a function of cycles in humid air. And this particular one that I showed you, which we call alpmoth, has good cycling stability in the laboratory up to 10 cycles. And what about the molecular aspects? So where, in fact, does water go, and where does CO2 go? In fact, is it the same as what the computer said it was? So here you see a blow-up structure of a portion of this metal organic framework, and you see the carbon atoms labeled here. And we have to ask the following question. When we put water in this system, where does the water go? And one way to measure that is with the carbon-13 NMR of these particular carbons. So their line width as a function of humidity tells them how close the water molecules are to those carbons. And the answer is up to 60% humidity, none of them are sensitive to water. And only when you got up to 80% or so do you see that the carbons close to the oxygens have any capacity to pick up water. Now I can label C13CO2 and put it inside of this system and conduct the same experiment. And I see that it appears that water is nowhere near the CO2. I can repeat that experiment in a way which is much, much more sensitive to the presence of water. And these are, again, carbon-13 NMR spectra, and they show you that the line shapes are very insensitive to the amount of water. And indeed, if I use water that has deuterium instead of hydrogen, so that this broadening mechanism wouldn't be present anyway, it's still the same, which is to say the adsorbophore was designed de novo, assessed for LCA and TEA. It was built from sustainable sources, and the NMR says it operated as designed. That's an example of how we're using these kind of concepts, looking at sources, looking at sinks, and evaluating materials on that basis. Let me just briefly show one other example of how we're using molecular scale design to think about materials for carbon capture. But first, I want to hone in on one of the points that Arun Majumdar made, which is how much does it cost to take CO2 directly out of air? I snapped this shot at Climeworks about a month ago when I was there. And you see these very elegant direct air capture units that are at this Climeworks facility. Climeworks is very kind. If you go to their webpage, you can buy CO2 removal for whatever CO2 you feel is you're associated with. So for example, go to that webpage. For 25 euros, you get 25 kilograms of CO2 removal, and so forth and so on. This is 1,000 euros per ton of CO2. And by the way, the Climeworks people were kind enough to say they're not making any money on that price. In fact, they're losing money on that price, which means between 1,000 and 2,000 euros a ton is what we're operating at for direct air capture. And it's just not acceptable. As Arun pointed out, we need to get this number down a lot more before we can start doing this at scale. So this led my group to imagine a slightly different approach towards molecular design of carbon capture, which is, why not use the chemical technology that is known to exist for the past 100 years, which is to say, I take an amine, I react it with CO2, and I form ammonium carbamate, I heat it up, and it comes back off again as CO2, and I regenerate the amine. And rather than do it in a solution so that I'm always heating water to do this reaction, I'm going to try and do this chemistry directly on a powder so that the regeneration costs, energy-wise, are much less. So if you're going to design a material, you go to your chemical engineering handbook and you find out what are some of the cheapest chemicals that you can buy. And one of them is melamine. Here's melamine. It's produced massively on an industrial scale at $40 a ton. Formaldehyde, similar pricing, very cheap. A reaction forms this porous network, which could be the basis of a carbon capture material. You might know this as formica or melamine as a porous polymer for dinnerware. It's not porous enough to capture CO2, so we modify the process by adding cyanuric acid. It's a little more expensive, but it's also already produced at scale for to clarify the water in swimming pools. So now you have an opened up melamine porous network. You see there's a lot of NH groups in this system, which could be reactive to CO2, but we're going to imbibe it with even more amine. This particular triamine is very, very cheap, also heavily produced. And so now we have a porous network, amine modified, and the question is, does it do the kind of chemistry we want? And if so, what are some of the properties of that material? And regrettably, there's a lot of different reactions that can occur in this system. I won't dwell on all these, but as you can imagine, CO2, the weak acid that it is, there's a lot of base in this material. There's a lot of ways the functional groups could combine in this system. Many, many different kinds of chemistry that could be going on. And so the way to unravel that is to deploy this panoply of NMR methods. And I won't dwell on those. I just want to talk about one in particular so that you can appreciate the sort of science, the sleuthing that happens to figure out these reaction mechanisms. This is a two-dimensional carbon-13 NMR spectrum. It's a topographical map, and it tells us something about how carbons and protons are related to each other. So here on this axis is carbon-13 chemical shift, and on this axis is proton chemical shift. And if I project down from the top, there would be a peak here, and that's the peak of carbons in the carbamate group. And if I were to project down here, those are the peaks for carbon in carbamic acid groups. And if I look at the cross peaks, that means this carbamic acid is in spatial proximity to an acid proton, and this one to an ammonium ion, and these two both to amide protons. So using these two-dimensional maps, then, my researchers can figure out who's bonded to whom in these complicated structures using pathways such as shown in this particular slide. And this wound up showing that in this melamine porous network imbibed with cyanuric acid and this triamine, ammonium carbamate pairs and carbamic acid pairs dominate the CO2 absorption. The kinetics, that is, the uptake of CO2 as a function of time, are really quite rapid for a porous material, and it cycles well under humid conditions that mimic coal-fired power plants. And so my postdoc right now, Hayam now, is working on extending these kind of networks towards direct air capture. I will just close by saying the direct air capture problem is vexing. Here's the most recent IEA report from last month. And as you can see from these bullet points, carbon capture and utilization and direct air capture are not on track to meet the goals that Arun so clearly identified for us earlier. And what are the things we need to solve in order to make these goals? Well, here is what's called a volcano plot, which is a bar chart which shows the cost of air capture and the range of those costs associated with particular aspects for, in this case, temperature or pressure swing absorption. And you can see the biggest uncertainty is the cost of the contactor. Arun made that very clear to us, that rates matter. And if the rates are low, the contactors are too big and the capital costs are too high. And he also mentioned the cost of thermal energy. Low desorption energies usually mean that it's easy to regenerate the material, but they often mean it isn't able to selectively capture CO2. And absorbent cost and lifetime and electrical energy and so forth. So we are a long way from $100 a ton. And so there's a great deal of work to be done. And I'm particularly grateful to the people in my group and the funding sources. And of course, many of the colleagues who I work closely with regard to some of these studies. So I think I've used up my time now. Thank you so much for your attention. And Jiwang, I'm really excited to tackle any open questions we might have.
Thank you very much, Jeff. It was really amazing to see sort of overview of this topic. At the same time, you really like showed the inspiring examples of your research topics from the CO2 and the last topics with the new, let's say, inexpensive materials, converting it to, let's say, competing with even MOP very well. Matteo, I think you can start the discussion by unmuting. Yes.
Sure. Thank you, Jiwon. Thank you, Jeff. That was a really great talk. I have a couple questions, maybe diving into the chemistry of what you showed. The first one is very interesting, something I didn't see before. In your first part with these MOFs made of aluminum, you talked about finding the right framework that would allow you to absorb CO2 and reject water. And I think this is the first time I see these aromatic frameworks that are proposed for CO2 capture. And we are used to see acid-base interactions like the type that you showed in the second part. So what is the interaction in those pyrene-based frameworks and the molecular interactions between CO2 and the framework that would then allow you to capture CO2?
Yeah, it's actually been known for some time that CO2 interacts with pi ring structures because of the rich electron. CO2 is a rich electron molecule, and so it's been well known to enjoy the environment in which there are pi electrons. So that wasn't a surprise to us, actually. What was a surprise is that you could actually design a material where the spacing, sorry, let me get this right, where the spacing between those layers was just right, because at 10 angstroms or 5 angstroms, it doesn't work, right? A really effective way to do that screening or to imagine what's happening at a molecular level is to do a DFT calculation for, you take 2 pyrenes and put them in space, and then you put CO2 in and calculate the force fields from DFT calculations. And it's pretty clear that CO2 is very favorably bound. It's also very clear that because it's so electron rich, it's a very hydrophobic environment. Water doesn't like that environment very much. So the bad news, let's just be honest with one another. So why aren't we deploying that material today? The answer is it doesn't have enough capacity. So we need to get that same molecular concept now at a scale where there's many, many more CO2s per gram, right? And at 1 millimole per gram of MOF material, it's not yet at scale. I'm not sure if I answered your question. I hope I did. Sorry.
Yes, Yes, that's great. Thank you, Jeff. Then if I may ask one other question before we move to the Q&As, I see some questions in the box. The second question is about these melamine pore networks. You said something that really struck me. You said that the initial melamine pore network was not good enough to absorb CO2, and you had to add this other molecule, the acid, in order to improve it. And I just wanted to ask you, from, again, a molecular standpoint, I see this melamine network as having lots of nitrogen groups and amino groups. Why is it that that is not good enough to absorb CO2 and you had to add this modifier?
Yeah, let me just show you that picture again real quick, okay? Yeah, maybe this one.
Yeah, correct.
So the problem with this network, Matteo, is that its porosity is too low. And, which you can measure with the usual, adsorption metrics. It's just not porous enough. And as it turns out, when we open it up with cyuranic acid and you examine carefully the CO2 adsorption capacity, this material does absorb CO2, and it reacts almost certainly with the secondary amines, but its capacity is far too low. And so that's why we decided to add the triamine to this system, figuring that we would just be able to improve the reactivity with the primary amines as opposed to the secondary amines. And so really the cyuranic acid was, as Arun mentioned, transport phenomena are important here, and we have to get CO2 in and out of these systems quickly. And it just was too slow and too small a pore volume. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I just wanted to point out to the challenges, right? That you just don't need the right interactions, but then it's about the pore network. So it's really fascinating. Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, no, thank you. Let me stop sharing screen here for a moment. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, so maybe I can continue with a couple of questions related to this melamine. So, usually like MOFs with the amino banded, it can suffer with the losing some of the amines on the metal coordinated site. How strong is that the hydrogen bonding interactions between the added triamine and the melamine backbone?
Yeah, that's a great question. As you probably know, Jiwang and other audience members, the amine appended systems, no matter what they are, tend to degrade over time. And one of the key ways they degrade is the amine slips. That is, it comes off the system. This is particularly true in the MOFs. So all I can say, Jiwang, is that at the laboratory scale, if you examine with, for example, NMR spectroscopy, the structure of the material freshly prepared, and then at the end of cycle 10, and ask, what are all the NMR peaks look like? And the answer is it's the same. Okay. But your question, I think, points out to something really important for lab scale researchers like us, or me anyway. Yeah. Which is that we really need to look at degradation before we start promoting the materials at pilot scale. And right now, I'm working with colleagues in the College of Chemistry, and we're looking at 8,000 or 10,000 cycles. Wow. As the benchmark in the laboratory to look for degradation. And as you might guess, not many materials survive that. Yeah. And so that's another challenge. Yeah, if you want this. Yeah. But I mean, one thing that I was wondering from the first section through your paper, that you kind of fixed the y-axis with the 5 millimole CO2 per gram of the material. Is it just a reason based on all the materials are within that range, or is there any theoretical boundary that we cannot go more than 28% or higher than capture? So yeah, excellent. Another excellent question. So if we imagine solid materials as tubes, with amine functionality in the tubes, there are pretty severe limits as to how many CO2s you can stuff in that system. And, it's somewhere between 5 and 10 millimoles per gram. And so another challenge, one we're working on now, is how do I imagine materials that are fully three-dimensional in their absorptive capacity and not, a stick structure with a tube, right? that's aligned with amine functionalities. Because if we can get that capacity into the 20s or 30s, then we're talking about game-changing decrease in the contactor size, right?
Yeah. So one question from the audience, Lars. So have you considered biological conversion of CO2 to make chemical products? Because the quality of the CO2 gas does not need to be as pure or high as for metal catalyst conversion.
Yeah, there's an entire, so when you say have me personally, like Arun, I am familiar with the literature, and there are institutes worldwide that are trying to do exactly that. I think the soil sequestration that Arun mentioned is really promising in this Marin Carbon project, which is a local one for us here in the Bay Area. So Matteo can enjoy that, and Arun, but it's a really great example of using biological conversion of CO2 to take CO2 out of the air and sequester it in the soils. There is a large and very productive community of people that are engineering organisms to take CO2 out of the air and produce something that might be useful, or produce something that can be easily sequestered. And somebody once suggested to me, why don't we just grow a lot of trees and then dump them in the ocean where they won't decay in time? And that's, for a lot of reasons, that doesn't pass the techno-economic and life cycle analysis test. But that concept is definitely being considered. That is, engineer microorganisms, take CO2 and put it somewhere where it's either reused or taken out permanently from the environment. Excellent approach.
Yeah. So maybe this is a little bit more like to the second topic from the audience. Han Lata asked if that your additive cyanuric acid to make it more porous, is there any interactions between the ether oxygens maybe remaining in the materials and then affecting the CO2 absorption in terms of also the structure? Because
these ether linkages, I think, is the question being asked, or something like that, right? Maybe I can. I'm not sure I can answer the answer to your question is I'm not sure. Okay, but let me just say we're pretty confident now that when we absorb CO2, it's really associated with the added triamine. The more interesting question, or the question that I'm focused on with my group right now, is where's the water going, right? And this particular functionality is a place where water is likely to go. And so one of the things we worry about in cycling stability is, does water interact with in this way to desorb the amine? And we're looking at that as a function of cycling. But the interaction between the cyanuric acid and CO2 is not relevant in our measurements. It's really only with the triamines. I think that answers the question.
Yeah. I think this whole combination of your fundamental understanding of the material using the spectroscopy and giving the knowledge about like how the bonds are made between CO2 and, let's say, some of the amines, and it's really giving a huge significant amount of knowledge for the community. So I think it's very something that we have to appreciate. I think time is almost up, and I think this is the time that we have to thank Jeff and Arun, if Arun is still around, but I'm not sure. But one last thing before closing the door. Now I have to be fast. Yes. Please sign up for the next CORC research talk lectures next month. So November 16th, we'll have Catherine from University of Copenhagen, and also the internal speaker, Maria from the CO2 Research Center, to talk about some modeling in terms of large-scale energy systems, including the carbon emission mitigation. So please use the CO2 research center corc.au.dk for the registration. Thank you everybody for joining this talk, and especially to Jeff and Arun, also Matteo for California, and looking forward to hearing from you and also audience. If you have any questions, please direct it to the administration or us. So looking forward to see you again next month. Thank you very much.
So long, everyone. Thanks all.